Hi, my name is Bridget Gramkowski, and I'm a pediatric nurse practitioner, and I'm going to be talking to you today about growth, development, and behavior in typical children and in the foster care population. I come to you from a background of being a pediatric nurse practitioner, and I've also been a licensed foster parent, and I taught science and math to junior high and high school students for 5 years as well. I'm a mom of 4 kids myself, and for 5 years I worked with advocates such as yourself on through a study at UCSF on foster care, and we were hoping to improve the health of adolescents in foster care using advocates to promote their health. So throughout this talk today, I'm going to be talking to you about typical development and also what we see in the foster care population. And I'm going to be giving you some examples of wonderful work that advocates such as yourself did with their young people. Today we're going to be talking about the state of health and development in foster kids. We're going to be talking about typical child development, going through all of the 8 stages of development in infants, school age, and adolescence. And we're going to talk about what we see in the foster care system, not just in terms of development of your children that you're going to be working with, but also the challenges within the system itself. And we're going to talk about what a great job you guys do as advocates. When I do this talk and I'm working with the folks in the classroom, we do a couple of activities. So you'll see slides that are about a couple of activities that we do. The first one is that we talk about what it's like to enter foster care. And we talk about the stresses, the physiologic stress that it puts on your body whenever you're put into a forced intimacy with another person. We also talk about Maslow's pyramid here, which you see on your screen, that talks about the basic needs that people need in order to be happy, healthy, productive people. This is a very old-fashioned piece of child development, but it's still something that we refer to. And as you can see, the base of this pyramid of needs is the physiologic needs, which is shelter, food, and comfort. Secondly is safety and security. Thirdly is belongingness and love. Fourthly is self-esteem, and fifth is self-actualization. So these are the things, the theory of what we need to be positive, productive people. And as you can see, if you think about a child in the foster care system, they often haven't had their very basic needs met, and certainly have not had their safety and security needs met, much less their belongingness and love. So they are stuck at the very bottom of this pyramid, and what our role is in the community as people who work with these kids in foster care is to hopefully provide all of these levels so that they can become confident, happy, productive people. I've got a bunch of slides throughout the presentation today from the the Foster Care Alumni of America postcard project. They're a little bit blurry, so I apologize. I'm going to read to you what the quotes say. This picture of a girl says that if anyone had taken photos of me at this age, I bet I would have looked like this girl. And that was something I saw many advocates doing, was taking wonderful pictures of their advocates, and not just pictures, but printing out the pictures and framing the pictures. And the kids really, really appreciated having things like that. We're going to be talking about, and before I get started on the outcomes of kids in foster care and what we see in terms of the health of children in foster care, I'd like to talk a little bit about the system that we do not use in the United States, and that is orphanages. We do not use institutionalized care in the United States, and it's really great that we don't. We see a lot of data coming out of the countries that are still forced to use institutionalized care for their young children. Russia, Guatemala, Romania, all of these countries have had extensive research done on the kids that they've had to put in these large caregiver situations. So one caregiver for 30 babies, for example. And we see delays in every realm or aspect of a development. We see it in terms of speech, in terms of brain development, in terms of growth, in terms of their ability to attend to something, in terms of their social development. Every possible aspect that we could measure, they are delayed if they're in these large group environments with one caregiver for a large number of children. and you even see more psychiatric disorders and more internalizing disorders, which I'm going to define a little bit later. We also saw, they did some research studies where they took those children that were put in institutionalized settings and they put them into foster care homes. And they saw that within 6 months to a year, these children had incredible growth in their, not just in terms of their physical growth. Sometimes we saw a doubling in their head circumference, which is a measurement of brain growth. We also saw tremendous gains in height. We saw language develop. We saw appropriate social relations. These children exploded in terms of their growth and development. And so we know that putting children in foster families is a much better system than putting them in institutionalized group care. And so that's great that that's what we're doing here in the U.S. and here in California. What we've learned from these large institutions is that not having a one-on-one relationship with a primary caregiver is a major cause of harm to children. And the best type of care these kids need is family-based care, and as soon as possible, by at least 6 months of age. So we know that foster care is much better than the old orphanage or institutional system. However, when we look at our population in the United States of foster care kids versus the typical or non-foster population, we can see a tremendous difference in their health outcomes. We know that they have significantly higher rates of health problems than children who are not in foster care. And even if we look at children who are from poor or low socioeconomic status, children in foster care have 3 to 7 times more health problems than kids who are just poor. We see that kids who are in foster care have 3 to 4 times the health problems as kids who are homeless. So we know that these kids are particularly vulnerable, and this is why we need people like you, advocates, working with these kids to be mindful of all aspects of their health and development. When we look at physical health differences, we see up to double the vision problems of non-foster kids. 1/3 of these children have been under-immunized, and what I also have seen is a lot of children who are over-immunized, so their records have been lost and they are having to get multiple sets of injections. We see greater risks of STD. We see higher lead levels, which directly impacts your brain development and your intelligence. And 50% of children who were in foster care after 18 months were still in poor health. And I think this is a particularly important thing for advocates to know, because you guys are often the people that, if these kids have been in the system, they've been identified as extra vulnerable, and they're coming to you, and sometimes they've been in the system for a while, and we like to think that all of their needs have been met, but sometimes they haven't. And so this is one of the things you can do as an advocate, is make sure that all of their needs have been met. We've done many studies to look at the long-term health outcomes of people in foster care. And these are retrospective studies. So they were studies where they asked people, have you ever been in foster care? Yes or no. And then, do you have any of these problems? And so people who ever had spent any time in foster care had much higher rates of arthritis, irritable bowel, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and 61% of youth in foster care have migraine headaches. So all of these problems that we've identified in this population are problems that Western medicine is not particularly good at fixing. These are chronic, lifelong problems, and are a result of that incredible stress of being in the foster care system, of losing a parent. All of that physiologic stress manifests itself in long-term health problems. We even see some problems that are specific to women, including endometriosis and uterine fibroids. We see a tremendous difference in the mental health of our kids in foster care versus non-foster populations. They have up to 8 times the psychopathology that non-foster kids have, and they use the psychiatric services 20 times more than other children who are on Medicaid or receiving services for being in low socioeconomic status. So we know that there's a tremendous difference in this population. I mentioned earlier we were talking about internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So when you have a tremendous amount of stress put on you, and it's certainly being put into foster care and then being a part of the foster care system is incredibly stressful. All of that stress, you take all of that stress and you have to do something with it. And so if you take all of that stress and you turn it inwards on yourself, then that's called an internalizing behavior. So these are anxiety, depression, sleep problems, somatic complaints, which are things like abdominal pain and headaches, and also eating disorders. These are taking that stress and turning it inwards on yourself. Externalizing behaviors are taking that incredible amount of stress and pushing it out. So these are attention problems, aggressive behavior, rule-breaking actions. You're taking that stress and you're pushing it out. So these are really common behaviors in the foster population, and sometimes you see a mixture of internalizing and externalizing behaviors. Traditionally, we thought of internalizing behaviors tend to be more female. Girls tend to do more internalizing behaviors and boys tend to do more externalizing behaviors, but that's not always true, and it really can be any mixture of both sides. But when you get your chart and you're choosing your young person to work with, you may see on the list of issues or concerns internalizing behaviors or externalizing behaviors, and this gives you an idea of what that might mean. We see more sexual behavior in teenagers who've been in the foster care system, so we see more sexual activity. We see earlier sexual debut, which means they start sexual activity earlier. They have more partners, and they have more pregnancies. We also see developmental delays is associated with any type of exposure to violence, unstable environment, or neglect, which pretty much is how you got in the foster care system in the first place. And unfortunately, sometimes being in the foster care system means that you have an unstable environment because you may be being moved repeatedly. So we tend to say, clinically, we tend to say that after you've been in the foster care for any period of time, certainly by the time you are a school-age child, that you have approximately a 2-year developmental delay. And the only silver lining in that is that in the school system, in order to receive school services and support services, you need to have a 2-year delay. Many of the classes that I worked with also chose to be educational surrogates, and so if that's something you would like to consider, that's a really wonderful pairing. It does mean an additional commitment, but it was a really wonderful pairing, and I saw a lot of advocates doing wonderful work as educational surrogates in addition to being the advocate. So back to a little bit of good news. The good news is that you are going to be an advocate, and you're going to be watching all of these things and helping all of these things, and hopefully eradicating some of these problems from these kids who have already had really difficult experiences. There's extensive research supporting your role, and one of my favorite examples of this research is a study that was done a couple of years ago at Yale, and they looked at youth who were mentored at 17 and 18, and they were found to be less likely to commit crime at 19 and 20, and the relationship was the better the relationship, the less the crime. So it was an inverse relationship, and really pointed to the importance of a true, sincere relationship between the mentor and the mentee. The other thing I really like about this study is that it was with older kids. These are teenagers, 17, 18-year-olds, and I think a lot of times we worry that this might be too late to intervene. And this study documented for us that it's nowhere near too late. And so you guys, you are a documented, well-researched, well-supported role, and I thank you for coming to do this today. After leaving foster care, we know that there's terrible, terrible outcomes for these kids. And I'm not going to read this slide to you. I never read this slide in the classroom because I feel like we already know all these terrible outcomes. These are terrible outcomes and these are the things that we're trying to prevent. And by having an advocate, we know that all of these terrible outcomes are less likely. So we know that foster kids have greater morbidity in all areas of health. Their mental health is worst of all, and they have terrible long-term outcomes, and this is where you come in. We have another postcard here from the Foster Care Postcard Project. This is, it says, "My life crammed into a plastic bag. Faded photographs of other people, every letter I ever received, mismatched holy socks, dime store tennies, high-water jeans, a tattered Bible, art supplies, my pride and hope, the official luggage of the foster care system." So when I'm talking to you about normative development today, I'm not expecting you to memorize all of these dates or terms or periods of time or even all of these milestones that I'm going to be talking about. What I would really like for you to take home from this talk is that you should trust yourself if you notice something is different or odd or seems not right, to follow up on it. Follow up on it with the foster parents, follow up with it with the social worker, talk to your supervisor about your areas of concern. And I'm going to be telling you some examples of things that CASAs noticed that were just common sense things to notice that really affected the long-term health and well-being of their young people. So when we look at child development, I'm going to start with just looking briefly at the period of in utero development. And we see that this is a very hard to read slide, but the reason I have this slide up here is that the first 9 weeks you have development of the heart, the eye, the ears, the palate, the external genitalia, the arms and the legs are all developed in that first 9 weeks. And that may be in a mom who is using drugs or is not receiving great health care, is not taking great care of herself. She might not even know that she's pregnant until that point. And so there may already be some ramifications of that for the child. And then the other thing I'd like to point out is that from about 20 weeks onward, it's almost entirely brain development. So anything that happens in that time period between 20 weeks and birth is primarily going to affect the brain. The other thing I'd like to mention too is that I think we sometimes think that if a baby, when they're born, is removed immediately from the parent, such as moms who are incarcerated, we think, okay, well that child was protected. But we know that babies can identify their mother's voices, and in fact, they just did a study recently about children's stories, that if you read a baby while they're in utero, if you read them a story, they can identify that same story once they've been born. They can also identify music. So we know that they will mourn the loss of the sound of their mother's voice. We also know that domestic violence increases in pregnancy. So these babies may have experienced violence in utero from domestic violence. When I first started doing this talk, I really tried to separate out drug exposure and whether or not that really mattered for the long-term outcome of the child, if we did everything we needed to do for that child once they had been born. And it was very difficult to separate out because oftentimes if a mother is using drugs, they're also doing a lot of other things that we know are damaging to child development, such as smoking, not getting prenatal care, things like that. So it's very hard to separate out. But there was one study done in Chicago that looked at the outcome of cocaine-exposed babies. And if you controlled for mother's mental health and poverty, the children who had been born with cocaine in their system were only 10 IQ points lower than their non-exposed counterparts. So again, the important thing there, the important factor in those children's development was mother's mental health and socioeconomic status. So I think the whole point of that is that there is hope that we can turn things around for these kids, even if they've been dealt a really unfair start. So when we talk about development, I'm going to be going over rapidly an area of child development, which many people study a tiny aspect of child development in their dissertations or PhDs that have very narrow areas of scope. I'm going to be very rapidly covering this entire period of development and growth from when they're born all the way through to their late adolescence. As a clinician, we always look at the areas of development. We look at gross motor, which is things like climbing stairs, jumping, hopping, crawling, rolling, things like that. Fine motor, which is things like a pinch or grasp, writing, typing, things like that. Language, which is language. Social and personal, which is things like looking at people, smiling at people, responding to people. And then physical growth. So the reason I have on here the CDC chart for growth, you can go to the CDC's website and look up typical growth. And the reason I have that on there is because one of the advocates that I was working with had a 12-year-old boy that she was working with. And after we'd been working with her a couple of months, she mentioned to me, she said, I feel a little odd saying this, but I think that he's kind of small. And she said, we didn't know the parents, so we couldn't compare his genetics and figure out whether or not he was in fact on track in terms of his growth. So she mentioned it to me. We went ahead and followed up with his physician. And in fact, she was right. He had an endocrine disorder and he wasn't growing appropriately. And the physicians were able to intervene and provide growth hormones. And she really changed that child's life by noticing that. So this is a great example of something that is a common sense observation that she just followed through with and trusted herself on, and it ended up yielding a really, really positive result. The other thing I also like to make clear is for us in Santa Clara County, we're lucky that we have a centralized system for caring for our kids in foster care. So all of the kids in foster care go to the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center for their foster care for anytime they're in foster care, that's where they get all of their medical care. And the great thing about that is no matter where they are placed, they always go back to the same doctors and nurses for their medical care. So the theory is that we never lose their records, and it also provides them with continuity of care, and it also gives them a base and a clinician who is accustomed to dealing with children in the foster care system. Children in the foster care system should be seen every 6 months by a doctor just for a checkup. Anytime they're in a new placement, they should be seen, and anytime there's a problem, they should be seen. In addition, the other thing to know that's important in California is that once you are 12 in California, you can consent to your own reproductive health care, which means that you could go to somewhere like Planned Parenthood and receive free medical care for any of your reproductive needs. So many of the advocates that I worked with were working with teenagers, and that was something that they were able to do. One of the foster moms that I worked with, she specialized in taking early adolescent boys. She always took sort of 13 to 14-year-old boys, and she wasn't quite a group home, but she usually had 3 or 4 boys that were in her in-home placement. And she was really great with them and had a great sense of humor. And she knew that they needed reproductive health education and that they needed to know how to access it, and she wanted them to be responsible about it, but she did not want to be talking to them about it. So what she would do is every year or so, whenever she had, every year or so, she would call Planned Parenthood, tell them who she was and what age her kids were that were in her care, and they would set up a special education session for that household. She brought all the kids in, and they each got a group sort of lesson, and then they each got a one-on-one session with a clinician to address any of their private needs or concerns. And that was a great way of handling that for her, because she didn't have to have that awkward conversation herself, but she, by doing that, gave them the information that they needed to keep themselves safe, and also told them, sort of gave them a message that if you need something, I will get you to where you can get your needs met. So again, that's something that some advocates would do, is assist their young people in getting to the services that they needed. So in the system, when we look at child development, the system designates any child under the age of 2 as an infant. Now, medically, we call infants under the age of 1, but in the system, we call them under the age of 2. And the goal is for children who are under the age of 2 to be placed by 6 months. They should be permanently placed by 6 months. And then there's a sliding scale from that age onwards. So the older you get, the longer you have to be placed. And the longest you should be in short-term placement is 18 months. So no child should be in everybody should be in a long-term placement by the time 18 months is up. Unfortunately, I can tell you that this almost never happens, that the timeline is much, much longer, and often is just a series of short-term placements for many of these kids. And we know that the older the child is and the more of a relationship they have with their parents, usually the longer we keep them in temporary placement with the hopes of reunification. So when we think about what that means in terms of development with the child and how they are, and removal from the home, and what that means in terms of their sense of loss or grief, if we think about infant development, we know that at 2 months, a child will recognize their parent or caregiver. At 3 months, they will reach for their parent or caregiver. At 6 months, they know a stranger. And at 9 months, they will fear a stranger. So if you think about it in either way, either they've been with their biologic parent and they are removed at any time during that time period, then they are going to experience that loss. Or if they were placed at birth with a foster care provider and then are reunited with their family, they're going to experience the loss of that caregiver. So either way, they're going to experience some loss. And here's where I'm going to talk about attachment. And this is really, I think it's been on a couple of the slides previously, and I deliberately haven't talked about it much because I'm going to talk about it extensively now. And the most important thing, the thing that we see the most difficult and intractable problems with kids who've been in foster care system is when they have problems with attachment. And pretty much everybody who has spent any time in foster care is going to have some sort of attachment difficulty. So I have this slide up here that talks about arousal and relaxation. And so you start at the top with a relaxed, for an example, let's talk about a baby who's relaxed and all of their needs are met. And when we think about the needs of a baby, there's probably 5 needs for a baby: that they need to be fed, that their temperature needs to be regulated, whether it be warm or cold. They need to sleep, they need to be dry, and they need to be held or nurtured, right? So when I had my twins, I would be so tired that sometimes I wrote myself this list and I would put it above the changing table because sometimes I would forget and miss one of the things that I should have been checking, like a diaper. So anyway, babies, when they're happy and relaxed, they're content and they're relaxed, they don't have any stress in their systems, and they're sleeping or happily resting or playing. Then they have a need, such as they're hungry or they're wet or they're cold or hot or they're lonely, and they express that need through crying. And that initiates a physiologic response. That need, having a need and not being able to meet that need, initiates a cascade in your hormonal system that results in a large flow of hormones, stress hormones throughout the body that cause your blood vessels to constrict. It causes your heart rate to increase. It causes your blood pressure to go up. And the longer it takes for that need to be met, the worse your hormones become. The more your hormones are released, and the more your body ramps up and gets stressed out because of the need being unmet. When that need is met, such as you feed a baby, the stress is decreased, the baby relaxes, all of those hormones go away, the blood vessels dilate, and the body is relaxed again, and the need is met. And throughout that cycle, what happens is that happens many, many, many times a day for a baby, and every time that happens, they have a need, they get aroused, stressed out, their need is met, and then they're relaxed. Every time that need is met by a person, that baby is learning that if I have a need, it will be met by a person. I will be helped by a person. And they learn over time to expect help from people. Now, if you don't get your needs met, or your needs are met intermittently or irregularly, then you learn not to trust that a person will help you if you have a need. And so this is what attachment disorder is not trusting a person to help you when you need help. In China, they had some very large institutions, very large ratios, 30 to 40 babies per caregiver. And when if you've ever held a baby or fed a baby, you know that in the beginning, when you're feeding a baby, a 2 or 3 month old baby, if you're feeding them with a bottle, first they're ravenous, they're so hungry, they're eating, gulping, 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 dramatically sucking down the food, desperately hungry. And then as they drink a first ounce or two, they slow down in their feeding. And they will look at you, and they will touch you, they will smile at you, they will make noises at you. It's the equivalent of a baby party. They love it. And it's a wonderful time for them to socialize and enjoy human companionship. And they use that time. Their need is being met by a person who's caring for them. It's their best possible scenario. It is so much fun for them. They love it. And this is teaching them, it's wonderfully reinforcing for them that people meet my needs and people are good and I feel good when I'm around people. What they did in China, because they couldn't take the time to have that slow down socialization period of time while they were feeding their babies, is they turned the babies around. So the babies were not looking at their caregivers when they were getting their bottles. They were looking at a wall or at a crib or some inanimate object. And those children did not learn that people were meeting their needs. And they did not socialize with the people who were meeting their needs. And they had catastrophic attachment disorder, which we see what attachment disorder does is it causes problems in almost every aspect of your functioning. So, which I'm going to list in a moment. So just to sort of review again, in secure attachment, you have the need of an infant, a child, or an adolescent. My example was with a baby, but you could see how that example holds true for a child, holds true for an adolescent. You have a need, the caregiver meets the need appropriately and consistently, and you learn to trust and seek out a caregiver or a person for your needs. And when that cycle does not happen, you end up with what's called attachment disorder or insecure attachment. And there's a variety of different types and names for the different subsets of attachment disorder, but loosely they can be grouped into two types. There's inhibited attachment disorder, which means kids are very withdrawn, detached, hypervigilant. They never need any help from anybody. They don't want any help from anybody. They have a great deal of difficulty accepting any help from anybody. And then the other type is disinhibited, where they're seeking attention constantly from anyone, a parent or a stranger. They do not differentiate between the two, and they're highly anxious. They appear highly anxious all the time. And I have two examples to share with you from advocates that I was working with. The first one is for the inhibited type of attachment disorder. So one of the advocates that I was working with, she had chosen, she really wanted to work with pregnant and parenting teens, but there was a teenager in the system who really needed an advocate, and so she agreed to take him. And this is another little pearl that I would love to pass on to you all, is that when you are choosing your child, make sure that it's a child that really speaks to you. Every successful advocate that I worked with said that there was something in the file that really leapt out at them and grabbed them and spoke to them. And they were incredible advocates. Remember, we talked earlier about that study that talked about the better the relationship with the mentor, the more protective it was. And so trust yourself. Allow yourself to, you get to choose this person. Make sure you choose someone that really seems to connect to you somehow. So she agreed to take this person, even though she didn't really feel that connection. And he was a hard person to work with. He was 18, he was in a group home, he was doing independent study. He had a tutor 3 hours a week, and then he watched TV the rest of the time. And she had a lot of trouble trying to get a relationship going with him. But she went to his house, went to the group home one day, and she noticed that he was holding his arm strangely and seemed to have trouble moving around. He was, wouldn't get off the couch, which he normally would. He was just something seemed wrong. And eventually she got the story from him that he and some friends had gone for a joyride on a bike or a motorcycle or something, and he had been doored. So which means that the door had opened and he had hit the door with the motorcycle or the bike, I can't remember which one it was, and he had flipped over the door and he had broken his arm. But of course, not only did he not want to get caught for doing the joyriding and being out of the group home, but he also had inhibited attachment. He had an attachment disorder. And so it did not occur to him that there was a problem that somebody might be able to fix or help him with. So he had broken his arm in several places, and it was very lucky that this advocate was able to get this information out of him, because if you had left it much longer, it would have been a much more difficult repair. But she was able to get into the emergency room and get his bone in a cast, his arm in a cast. So this is an example of inhibited attachment, not going to seek out any care, tell everybody they're fine, even when they're not. So again, trust your instincts. She just noticed that something didn't seem right. He didn't seem to be moving right, and she was able to get to the bottom of that. Disinhibited is when you cannot differentiate a stranger from a trusted adult or a trusted person. So one of the advocates that I was working with, she had been placed with a girl who was 13, I believe, and she had been having some trouble with a girl bully at her school, and had just been having a lot of peer difficulties in general. And the very first time that this advocate met with this girl, they sat down at a restaurant together, and this girl told the CASA every single sordid, difficult detail of her life in this very first meeting over their very first meal. And so the first time I met with the advocate, she said to me, I hope it's because she really feels comfortable with me, and we've established this really great rapport, but it seems a little odd to me that she's given me all of this story right as soon as we've met. And she's right. She was exactly right. That isn't typical. You shouldn't be telling a brand new person all of your deepest, darkest secrets. And she was right. This was an example of a disinhibited attachment disorder. And unfortunately, a week later, I got a call from the advocate, and this poor girl had been raped by a student at the school. And the police had been called in, services were being done, but the young person in foster care had gone to school the next week and had told the bully about the assault. And then the bully had told the rest of the school and changed the story and created an incredibly hostile and toxic environment for this girl in foster care. Luckily, this girl had an advocate, and she was able to say, this is an unfixable situation. We need to get this girl out of this school right away. and we pulled her out of the school and put her in a different school. But this is an example of this girl had an attachment disorder. She could not differentiate between telling her advocate about the assault and telling a girl who'd been bullying her terribly about the assault. She could not differentiate between the two. Who would help her and who would hurt her in that situation? The other thing that I would give you as my 3 pieces of advice: 1 is trust yourself and if you notice something, go ahead and follow up on it. 2 is choose a child that speaks to you when you get those files. And the third thing is find somebody in your training program that you can talk to about the difficulties that you'll encounter when you're doing your advocacy work, because it can be really, really challenging. And whether it's the successes or whether it's the difficulties, it's really important to have somebody who you can share that with. You have your supervisor, and you have the social worker, of course, and the foster parent, but it's really nice to have somebody else who's doing this really specialized role that you are doing as well. So try and find a buddy. So the other thing we see with attachment disorder is reactive attachment disorder, which is an aversion to touch and physical affection. And many kids in foster care, because they've been abused, have this anyway. And so you never touch a child who's been in foster care. You're not going to initiate any kind of contact with your young person. If at some point there is some time when it is appropriate to give a hug or something like that, then you do a side hug, which means that they can get out of it at any time and it's very non-threatening. But again, you let them show you what kind of affection they would like to, they feel comfortable with. This is another postcard. It says they said I had an attachment disorder. Really, I had a life disorder and I attached accordingly. And I feel like that is very true. As we talked about with that cycle of attachment, it is a learned behavior, and that is what it is. It's not the child's fault that they have an attachment disorder. It's absolutely a product of their environment. We've done a lot of research and studies on the brain development and how attachment disorder and living under incredible stress as a child affects the brain. And we know that having an unmet need or really high levels of stress hormones over a long period of time, and those stress hormones you may have heard in the past in biology class, it's called fight or flight hormones. So it's that physiologic kind of panicky response that we all have when we're feeling unsafe or threatened. Which is also what we feel when we have an unmet need. That leads to more stress, an increased level of hormones being triggered, and your amygdala, which is the part of your brain responsible for your fight or flight reflex and sort of is your very primitive core part of your brain, is triggered and grows to respond to this unsafe world that it's in. So your brain adapts to an unsafe place by making the thing that makes you panic more bigger and stronger. And unfortunately, and then that of course makes you more nervous, more anxious, and more hypervigilant. So we see that a lot in these kids, that they're very, very vigilant. And unfortunately, the amygdala is placed right next to the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for learning and memory. And when the amygdala grows, the hippocampus shrinks. So it's not a coincidence that these kids have a great deal of difficulty in school, because their bodies have now been wired for an incredibly unsafe, panicky world. They have not been wired to sit quietly in a classroom and absorb 6 hours of information. We see that attachment is vital to almost all aspects of being successful as a person in our society. Intellect, concentration, socialization, ability to cope with stress, your development of a conscience. If you can't trust other people, then why are you going to care about other people? And your ability to delay gratification. Again, tied into that, why do other people matter? If other people are never going to help you, why is it important to help other people? So that we're going to see threads of that throughout the rest of our conversation. But I'm going to start with talking about infant development and what we see typically in babies. Babies have a sort of what we call a temperament. It's not quite a personality, but it's a way they enter the world. And some babies are very easy. They sleep easily. They only cry when they're hungry, and then they fall right back to sleep, or they hang out in a happy, peaceful way. Some babies are very difficult. They are grumpy. They cry a lot and require a lot of care. Those babies are more at risk for abuse. And then some babies are very slow to warm up, so they only bond with their primary caregiver, and they are really inconsolable with anybody else. And so those kids also have a very difficult time if they're put into a foster care situation. At typical development between 2 and 6 months, you should be seeing a baby that's moving everything equally and regularly. So arms and legs should all be moving equally and regularly. There is no handedness in children until the age of 1. So you should never see a baby who's only using their right hand for stuff. That is a problem and should be followed up. You should hear noises coming from babies, and they should notice things. They should notice loud sounds. They should notice faces. They should notice movement. You should see them tracking, which means them watching things happening. They should be interested and engaged in what's happening around them. And then from 6 to 12 months, we see a lot of gross motor development during this time period. This is when they start to sit, they roll over, they crawl, and then they should be pulling to stand and possibly walking. They certainly should be walking by themselves, no holding a finger, no extra supports by the age of 18 months. We also should see speech emerging around by 12 months. There should be about 3 words, mama, dada, and usually their favorite objects such as ball. Sometimes it's no, but it should be at least 3 words by the age of 12 months. This next slide is about object permanence and stranger anxiety. You remember earlier I mentioned that 9-month-olds know a stranger and fear a stranger. So this is a picture of a baby looking at a monkey, and then they put a board in front of the baby so that she could no longer see the monkey. And you see now that she's looking at the person taking the pictures, because in her mind, the monkey is gone from the universe. There's nothing to do. It has just disappeared from her whole life, and there's nothing to do about it. But after the age of 9 months, when they have what's called object permanence, she will understand that that object, that monkey, still exists, and it's probably behind the board, and so she will look for it. So this is when you see the emergence of all those games that babies like to play, like they drop things all the time and think that's really funny to play drop it and pick it up. Peekaboo cracks them up because it's reinforcing for them that, wow, you did not disappear from the universe. You're just right there behind your hands. And they love that. They love all of those things. But if we think about that in terms of being in the foster care system, that idea of object permanence, that idea that somebody hasn't just disappeared from your life and is poof, magically gone, but that they are still out there somewhere, the babies are going to be looking for them. Children are going to be looking for their caregiver or their biological parent. Then when we see typical development between 12 and 24 months is that we see a lot of mimicry. We're modeling adults' behavior. So, hopefully that's a lot of typical behavior like cooking and cleaning and, they should be eating independently, all of those things. But again, if they've seen things in foster care, terrible things in foster care, you may see them modeling those things or mimicking those things in their placements. Once children hit 2 to 4 years, again, there's a lot of really big gross motor development. They should be increasingly clear with their speech. You should be able to understand everything a child says by the time they're 4. They should have sentences. They should be appropriate in their speech. So you need to be able to you should be able to have little mini conversations with them. They also should be able to do things like swings. This is a great age for you to be bringing your kids to playgrounds and doing activities with them like that, because it's a great time period for development, and many of these children, if they were neglected or in a home where they weren't taken out very much, they haven't had the opportunity to do to master a lot of the things that 2 to 4 year olds really enjoy mastering and is really important for them to master, such as riding a tricycle, throwing and catching a ball, things like that. The next slide is talking about I have 3 on there, and it's because if we catch any developmental delay before the age of 3, we can really, really help the child. And in fact, many kids, if they're caught early, have no symptoms of delay by the time they're 5 or 6, because that early intervention is so effective. But the longer we wait and the longer we delay in addressing these developmental delays, the less productive and positive the outcome. So if you identify a child with needs before the age of 3, they go to what's called the regional center. So here in Santa Clara County, there's a regional center where you take your child and they are evaluated for free. The state does this for anybody, and this not just kids in the system. You're evaluated for free, and then if you are in the system, you are referred for services if you qualify. And it used to be that you needed 2 things to qualify to be to get services at the regional center, and one of them was being in foster care, because we know that foster care results in a developmental delay. But unfortunately, with the budget cutbacks, we no longer have that nice little safety window, so you need to have two problems in order to get services through the regional center. And these are all systems that are in place and that your social workers should know how to access, and that your foster parent will probably know how to access. And certainly you can be working with all of the folks involved in getting these services done. This doesn't have to be done by you by yourself. I always include a brief slide on autism, because I think it's always on our mind whenever we hear developmental delay. And the hallmark for autism is really that they do not have typical development. They're not looking at people's faces. They're not responding to social situations. And they have restricted interests, and their play is non-functional. So for example, a functional way of playing with a train is to drive it and say choo-choo and pick up packages and drop people off and mimic what a normal train would do, and have some sort of narrative or story with your train. A non-functional way of playing with a toy of a train is flipping it upside down and watching the wheels spin. That is a non-functional way of playing with a toy. So if you're working with a child and they're not playing in a typical way, or in a way that you've seen your children play, or you think most children play, go ahead and ask, has anybody looked at this? What do we think of this? Sometimes kids have come in and they've just been so neglected that they don't know how to play functionally, and you should see incredible growth and changes. But just because they've been in the foster care system, we don't want to miss these things. As we talked about earlier, many kids who've been in the foster care system for 18 months still hadn't had their health care needs met. So if you notice something that doesn't seem right, please don't excuse it. It's not that they're a boy. It's not that they've been neglected. It's not that they're in the foster care system. It's if something isn't right, we need to help them and support them. Preschool is a really big topic for everyone who has preschool age children. And there's an incredible variety of types of preschools out there, ones that are very loose and unstructured, and then there are highly regimented academic programs as well. And these children in foster care, need to be in a strong preschool program, a preschool program that teaches them to sit still, keep their hands to themselves, attend a task, follow directions. All of those things need to be happening at a preschool that these kids attend, and they all should be attending some form of preschool. San Jose Unified has a preschool program for kids in low socioeconomic status, or kids who are in foster care can apply to be in these programs. The county has funds for kids to be going to these programs. So just make sure that if you're working with a child this age, that they're getting some exposure to school readiness. Because as you can see from this next slide about kindergarten readiness, there's a tremendous amount that children need to know before they start kindergarten now. They've really shifted kindergarten from being a primarily play-based socializing experience to an academic one. And essentially it's what used to be first grade is now kindergarten. So kids are expected to be able to do all of these things. They're supposed to be able to use pencils. They're supposed to already know how to write. They're supposed to be able to sit and attend for at least 20 minutes at a time, all of these things. And for example, in many of the school districts around here, San Jose Unified included, there's 30 kids and 1 teacher, no aide. So if you're coming in and you're at a disadvantage, it's very difficult for you to get the time and the services and the support to get up to speed. So that's again why preschool is important, and then also why really keeping a close eye on the academic performance of your young person is really, really important. We see in middle childhood, this is the age of mastery, it's called. And this is the time when, in a non-foster household where kids are typically doing a million different activities. They're going to soccer and baseball and playing the flute and taking an art class and doing the school play. This is the time when they explore all these fun, different things. They find some things that they're good at, they can feel proud of and confident in, and it provides them a strong sense of identity. This is also the time when they're doing a lot of play dates and interacting with their peers in that way. And kids in foster care often have a great deal of difficulty having play dates. Now, number one, because they get a lot of questions if they have a friend over and they're not with their biologic parent. Or if they're moved around, it's difficult for them to maintain the relationships with their peers. So this is something that you can pay attention to and find out, is there somebody that you'd like to get together with for a play date? Or is there an activity that you would like to try or that you used to do that you'd like to go back to? And there's money in the system for those programs. There's also programs through the YMCA that are low or reduced cost. So there's a lot of places out there that you can find these types of things. There's also, we had some CASAs doing some really wonderful work, advocacy work around camps and finding camps for kids that were specialized to whatever their circumstances were. So for example, there's a camp up in Marin that's for children with incarcerated parents. And you can start going, I think, at the age of 8. And then as you get older, you can become a counselor. And all of the children who go there have at least one incarcerated parent. And kids who have incarcerated parents are at sort of a risk of a double stigma. Not only are they in foster care, but their parent is also incarcerated. So it's incredibly difficult for those kids. And it's really, really positive for them to go to a place where that is a norm, and that they can feel that they can explore other aspects of themselves without worrying about that piece of their story. One of the advocates that I worked with, her young person had missed the deadline for the camp, and we were able to, by just calling and sending a letter, we were able to get her young person into the camp, even though it had already closed. So again, it's a great example. That was another great example of how having a CASA, like a social worker, would not have had the time to do that. The social worker had filled out the paperwork, had tried to get the kid in, missed the deadline. That was it. The camp was full, according to the standard email that they sent out. But by just doing that little extra push and giving it that little extra attention that an advocate can, we were able to get that girl in, and then she was able to go back every year. And it was an opportunity for her to lead as she got older as well. Okay, so when we see kids in foster care in this age range, the other thing that we see a lot of that's really difficult is sibling separation, and finding the siblings, and difficulty with their sibling relationships. And so many of the advocates that I worked with would go to great pains to reunite these young people with each other. And sometimes they're really, really far flung. They're sometimes hours apart in terms of placement. They're sometimes out of county placements, and it's really difficult to get the whole system to coordinate to get them together. But it's a really, really powerful and important thing to do if you can. One of the stories that we had at UCSF was a pair of sisters were placed with a foster parent, and they were 10 and 11, and they fought terribly, like really vicious, violent arguments. And the foster parent was really overwhelmed and didn't know what to do, didn't know how to cope with it. So she called the social worker and said, "You have to take one of them, because I can't deal with this level of aggression and fighting in the house." And so the social worker showed up. This was many years ago, so we do this a little better now, I think. But the social worker showed up, separated the girls, sent one girl to another home. And it turned out later, when they interviewed these girls were fighting over things like who got to sit next to the foster parent and who got to read the first book with the foster parent. And it was all actually really typical sibling rivalry over this foster parent who they both really cared for. And because these kids had seen abuse and seen a lot of violence, that was how they argued, because that was what they knew. And really, that was a great example of that foster parent just needed more support. And maybe if they had had an advocate in there to maybe help or mediate or ask for more services and support, then they wouldn't have had to separate that pair. Okay. The other thing that's important to continue to watch in the elementary school years is academic performance. And we see there's sort of some very traditional drop-offs points as the academic demands increase in the school day, in the school trajectory. So in kindergarten to first grade, you see a big jump in their level of attention that they're required to have and their language skills. In third to fourth grade, there's a shift from learning to read to reading to learn, and they're expected to have completely mastered and be totally proficient in their literacy skills by then. 6th to 7th grade, they need to have a lot of organization, and they take on a lot of extra responsibility, especially if they're going to 7 classes a day. It's also a time when, if people knew them in the elementary school and they were able to sort of nurture them and kind of support them, sometimes there's a lot of undocumented but wonderful support going on in the elementary school age, and then they shift to a different school where they aren't known, or there isn't that sort of informal support happening, and you see a sort of a catastrophic drop in all of their grades and in their connectedness to the school. And the reason that we care about school success so much is that it's the number one indicator of lifelong health is school success. So we really, really want to make sure that we're doing everything we can for these kids. And as soon as we see an early problem, respond to that early problem before it gets totally away from us. Again, in 8th to 9th grade, there's a big shift in abstract thinking and critical thinking that, again, you can see a big drop off. And again, there's the school change. So again, that's a risk as well. So in the classroom, I sometimes have the advocates do this next little activity, which is where you think about who you'd like to work with and what age group you'd like to work with, what draws you to that age group, what experience do you have, and what concerns do you have with that age group. And I will give you an example of somebody who was really successful as a very young CASA. She was a 22-year-old advocate, and she was advocating for a 16-year-old. And so, it's a very small gap in their ages, and I wasn't quite sure how that was going to go. And we were really worried about this 16-year-old. She was not on track to graduate from high school, and it was before we had passed the law that allowed foster kids to stay in the system until they were 21. If you didn't graduate or weren't on track to graduate, then you got kicked out of the system at 18 or 19. So we were really worried about this girl because she wasn't on track to graduate. We weren't sure we were going to be able to get her there. She was failing a lot of classes. She wasn't going to a lot of classes. It was really hard to get her to plan for her future or get her on board with any kind of plan towards her future. But this advocate noticed that every time anybody in the group home had a special activity or event, that they went to this girl for their hair and makeup and nails. She was incredibly gifted and did a really good job. And everybody knew that in the group home. And because this advocate was younger and sort of paying attention to those types of things and had a rapport with the other girls in the group home, she was able to pick up on this. And this is actually a really wonderful thing. This could be her career. It could be her vocation. So she was able to then get her into some training and some classes and and use that wonderful talent to become an actual skill and trade. So I think, again, it's really important to pick an age that really that you're going to have a lot of positivity about. I think sometimes people, if they're parenting a teenager and they're finding that difficult, it will be hard for you to be an advocate for a teenager at the same time because you're dealing with a lot of the same difficulties. So think about where you are in your life and what would be good for you, and then trust yourself on that.